Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the IoT for All podcast. I'm Ryan Chacon, and on today's episode, we're going to talk about what you should focus on first when building an IoT solution, where most people fail, how to future-proof hardware, software, those kinds of things, how to ensure or give yourself a better chance of success, and then how to scale from, a few devices to hundreds to thousands and beyond. Very exciting conversation. I have the CTO and the head of hardware from Intent. They're a company that has over 10 years of experience helping to conceptualize, design, and build apps for connected devices. Great conversation. I think we get a lot of value out of it. But before we get into this episode, we truly appreciate it if you give this video a thumbs up, subscribe to our channel if you have not done so already, and hit that bell icon to get the latest episodes as soon as they're out. Other than that, on to the episode. Welcome to the IoT for All podcast. Thanks for being here this week.
Great to be here.
Hello.
Yeah, it's great to have both of you here. Very interesting conversation. I'm excited to have here with you both. But let me kick this off by having you give a quick introduction about yourself and the company to our audience. And Peter, we'll start with you.
Sure. So my name is Peter. I'm a mobile engineer by passion and by education. I started building apps way before the term apps was coined. So in the days of Palm OS, Symbian OS, all that jazz. And I work at Intent as a CTO. And Intent is a software consultancy that builds software at the intersection of physical and digital worlds. So any project that has a physical manifestation is kind of our sweet spot.
My name is Przemek Łagut. I'm head of hardware in Intent. My biggest experience is related to the hardware and embedded software.
Fantastic. All right, so I wanted to jump right into the conversation here. A lot of interesting stuff to cover for sure. The first thing I wanted to ask you from both of your all's vantage points, experiences, when it comes to building a solution, a lot of our audience is out there looking to adopt solutions, looking to bring solutions to market. There's a lot of components that go into a successful solution, from the hardware to the software, embedded systems, the cloud, the connectivity, you name it. How do you think through all of that, and what do you recommend that they focus on first, given they have kind of the choice?
So I this is probably not the answer everybody wants to hear, but I'll say it anyway. I think having a perspective, a helicopter view of everything, of every single component out there, it doesn't mean that you have to do it all by yourself in-house, but being able to holistically think about a product, and the product is comprised of the app, the firmware, the hardware, the cloud, the probably the web browser version of your app. It all comes into play, and it's equally as important to to dedicate enough care for each and every one of these aspects of your product. And I don't think one will exist without the other. So again, that doesn't mean that you have to do it in-house. That's where we step in with our expertise for many startups and scale-ups, but having a firm like a helicopter view of your entire program, your entire value prop I think is really crucial for the success of their off.
Yeah, I fully agree with Peter that the technology is of course important, but at the beginning you have to take care about the helicopter view, everything around the technology, to define what you want to do.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. It's understanding what you're trying to accomplish. Sometimes, thinking from almost the end user backwards, and then really figuring out what all the pieces you need to put together to bring a solution to life, or to which solution to adopt, I think is super critical. And not enough times do companies focus on that for sure.
And also, I would even add that, technology aside, because building, again, this is a well-kept secret, but building is not the hardest thing out there, right? Validating your concept and making sure that you're building the right thing that will resonate with the market, that will find its target audience, that will get the product market fit. I think that's the hardest thing. Once you figure this out, what you want to build, then building technology is relatively straightforward.
How do you kind of approach finding product market fit, or how do you kind of approach getting to that point where you're confident in, or at least, more confident in what you need to build? And now, like you said, building is probably the lesser of the harder parts. How do you kind of advise companies, or how do you all think through getting to that point where you feel like, okay, now we know what we need to build and we feel like we're in a good spot?
We advise our partners to dedicate a lot of time to the market research phase, the validation phase, before we even write a single line of code. We may do that for, dirty throwaway prototypes that we then validate with actual users. But I would, I advise everybody to, and again, I'm an engineer, so I kind of, have to cool down my aspirations and my passions to, to get started, to get building. But actually, the wisest approach, in my opinion, is delay building as much as you can until you get enough of a conviction that what you're building, what you've dreamed about, is will actually find a customer.
Yeah, it's and does that change at any point in, or with any of the components within a solution? I mean, obviously, software and hardware are quite different, right? So, does that approach change in your mind when you're approaching the hardware or approaching the software? Is it kind of the same?
It's of course it's different, because once you arrive at a piece of hardware, it's relatively hard to change it, right? Whereas in software, you can keep iterating on through means like over the air updates, right? So of course we advise our partners to spend extra time making sure that the hardware that they're building, the bill of materials, is exactly what they want to do, right? So and has enough of a evidence in user research, user interviews, other validation methods to start manufacturing it.
Hardware is something physically, so you have to not only design it by technology, but also the shape, the enclosure, the how this device has to look like. This is also important. So I try to spend a lot of time to speak with the customer to define what is possible, what we can do, what is possible writing in relation to them, to the technology of producing something.
Absolutely. Now, when we get to the point of like ready to deploy a solution, there obviously are more challenges that arise then and also after a deployment. We talk about at times how many solutions get into the pilot stage and then fail. But when it comes to just like at a high level, the deployment of an IoT solution, where do you all see most companies that either you are observing or maybe have worked with in some capacity, or they've shared from past experiences, they haven't had maybe the greatest success with deployment? So, where are they failing? What are some of those stories you may be able to share with us?
Okay. I'll think about specifics and may throw in one or two examples in a bit, but I would say that the most underestimated thing is the amount of work you have to put into the product after launch, right? Everybody looks up at the deadline of, when are we going to ship it, right? And that's this glorified moment when a lot of people actually think that the tech team, the engineering team, will stop working and focus on something else. But the fact of the matter is, once you deploy the product, once it finds itself in the hands of the users, the game really begins there, right? Then you don't have people who deeply understand the product who use it. Now the product ends up in the hands of people who perhaps have no idea. They are not as technical as we all are. The amount of investment into customer support is minimal, and in many cases we worked on. So I think making sure that the users that are using your product are well taken care of I think is the single most underestimated aspect of post launch, right? So making sure that the UX is there, that the product is obvious, that people have some phone number to call in case something doesn't work. And returns are really expensive. They can kill your company.
And I imagine like just being able to get feedback and learn from the interactions and the engagement that those end users are having with the actual solution contribute a lot to the ability to make changes, iterations, send updates, just ensure that's working as properly as possible, maybe catch some things that could lead to failure ahead of time.
Of course. And there are so many tools that you can employ both on the software side and hardware side, telemetry, Crashlytics, analytics, all these things will help you tune the product so it best serves users. But again, I think more often than not, people think of the ship date as this finish line, whereas we often perceive it as a starting point, really.
Yeah, absolutely. And since we have your head of hardware here, I should ask on the hardware side, do you kind of see any failures or issues kind of coming from that end of the world?
Technology is going very fast, so we are changing the lives almost day by day. Yes, starting from 5 years ago, we started Bluetooth. Now, a lot of devices is connected over Wi-Fi and then other specific connection, narrowband, ultra wideband to measure the distance between the devices and so on and so on. So it's really this part of the PX world. It's really fast.
Absolutely. Now, let's think about, we talked through deploying, and you mentioned it's kind of more of a starting point as opposed to a finish line as other people think about it. But, as a solution is deployed, scaled, there's always going to be questions about, well, what happens when technology changes? What happens when we install a new system internally? Or what happens when things need to be updated? How do you go about that future proofing of the hardware and software to, the best of your ability? Obviously, you only know so much, but what are the steps, or what is the thought process like, or advice to kind of share with our audience on how to think through future proofing both the hardware and software side?
Sure. So, it really starts with the validation phase, right? So making sure that the product market fit that you'll find is then build the concept of what you're building is built on the right stack, right? So making sure that your firmware technology is future proof, will not go away. Making sure that your mobile development stack is something that is relatively future proof. Of course, there are so many tools out there right now, starting from native development with React Native and Flutter and so many others that so you really have to think about starting with technology, making sure that you will be able then to find people who will drive this technology, because it's not a sprint, it's a marathon. So just making sure that the talent will be there in 3-4 years, right? Because your product will be there. So making sure that the talent to keep iterating on the technology side of things, on the software side of things, will be there. Making sure that you're building your solution on the relatively future-proof backend or cloud services, right? We all know the story with Google's IoT offering wrapping up. So, this is not necessarily something that people could foresee. Although Google's track record is what it is, in terms of killing products really quickly. But you really have to think through a lot of things, starting with your software stack, through the hardware components, making sure that these will be available down the line, and then making sure that you have means to, like we've said before, right, to listen and to understand how people are actually using your product. So having closed loop with analytics, with telemetry, getting raw data out of your device's sensors. All these things come into play, right?
There is also another things related to the hardware, because more hardware than software. For sure, you have to be ready for the future updates. So doesn't mean that you methodology to update your device, but you need also some memory, you need some MIPS on your microcontrollers to for the future features. It's also important.
No, totally. Absolutely. I mean, it comes from both sides. I mean, we talked on the podcast before about network sunsetting and things like that, and how do you prepare or protect against that, which obviously you only can do so much, but it's with recent kind of network sunsets, it's become much more popular conversation on how to prepare with more devices in the field. A lot of devices you may not be able to even physically interact with at times. So how do you prepare for that kind of thing? And that carries over to the hardware pieces, the software pieces, kind of everything, even outside of just the network. So it's definitely a question that a lot of companies, I'm sure, have when it comes to adopting, as well as building and launching these solutions for people to adopt. Is there a way really to kind of ensure product success? I mean, there's just so many variables at times, I feel like, but obviously the industry has come a long way. We're learning so much with every deployment, with every new technology. Technology is getting more mature. How do you all kind of like, I guess, how would you answer that question if someone was to say, can you ensure that my product is successful? I mean, obviously we only can do so much. So, and we, you all can only do so much, right? So how do you kind of think about that kind of maybe thought that I'm sure customers have?
Yeah, you said it. We can only do so much, right? Collectively. So I don't think that there is a single way to ensure that your product will be successful. You can do everything right and then trip over something that you haven't foreseen, or there can be a competitor that was, in stealth mode and just popped up. I would say, coming back to what we've said before, invest as much time as possible into validating your concept against real users. I mean, I love to listen to my gut, but it's not always right. I'm often surprised by what people actually need out of technology, and these are rarely things that I expect from technology. So really invest a lot of time, push that moment when you start writing lines of code, prototyping as far as you possibly can, and make sure that you have enough of a market signal to pull a trigger on an idea. Yeah,
I agree. I think I've had some guests recently talking about what you can do leading up to any physical deployment with simulation, using digital twins, other types of technology to test as much as you can, which again can only do so much, and then understanding the industry that you're building for through hopefully the customer you're working with and their expertise and domain knowledge. But again, you only can get so close to thinking, okay, we're ready to go, ready to build. We know this is going to be valuable. If you're selling, especially into, or you're building for somebody who's then selling to their own customers and hoping that the demand is there. But when you build directly for one company, they still have to see an ROI, right? And they can only show so much of an ROI through a pilot. But once they get it deployed and start to scale, that's when the real value is. So being able to show that win early on so that they can justify internally the cost and the time to scale, I think is a big challenge. But and when you do that, it leads to a lot of success for companies across the board.
100%. It's easier than ever to build stuff, right? So it really boils down to finding that niche, to finding that passionate group of users who will be your power users.
Totally agree. I guess this leads into a good question that I wanted to ask you before we wrap up here is, we've talked all the way through where to start, how to deploy with a better chance of success, how to future-proof, those kinds of things. But let's say we get through all of that successfully. The pilot's a success. We're ready to scale. How do you go from 10 devices to 100 to 1,000 and beyond successfully? I'm sure a lot of that starts earlier on than you think, as far as how to prepare yourself for it. But when we get to that scale phase, what's different about that, or what do you now need to start thinking about?
Okay, you have to think about this at the beginning, because it's not so easy to move from, as you said, 10 pieces to 1 million or even more. If you have to change it in the meantime. So at the beginning, you have to start to think about what the production team does it looks like, how to make the enclosure, how to make a test automatic, use as much as possible the automation of this process, and so on and so on.
Yeah, it's really, like I said before, it's really easy to start building. There are so many ready to use building blocks, but if you want to scale, beyond the initial 10 pieces that you will quickly bang out in your home, you really need to think about what components you're using. Are you able to source these components? Where are you going to logistically do the manufacturing? Who is going to be putting together, the enclosures and distribution and logistics? This is something that people rarely think about when they're they come up with their first initial prototype based on Arduino, which is again relatively simple to get going, but then whole class of new problems start when you're thinking about producing 1,000, 10,000, or 100,000 devices.
Yeah, very good points. I mean, it's great when you can get to that stage to kind of start to scale, but obviously it brings in different challenges and thoughts that you need to really think through. And I know it varies depending on the use case, the industry, the environment, what technologies you're using. It's a lot, but I think it's important for people out there to understand that if you find the right company to work with, to bring your kind of solution to life or to market, however you're approaching it, a lot of this has already been experienced, learned from, kind of adapted for. So it's important to understand that even though it can be overwhelming at times when it comes to thinking about how a solution is going to be put together, people out there like you all know how to do this. It's just, does that company have a real problem, a real business case, and then proving that out and then, working together to make it successful. I think super important to remember. Let me ask both of you before I let you go. So, as we head into the rest of this year, what are you kind of most looking forward to, excited about from an industry perspective? Is there anything that we should be keeping an eye out for from each of your kind of lenses, just out of curiosity?
I'm really astounded by the progress I see with large language models every day. It seems like we're making a really ginormous leap almost every day on a daily basis. On a daily basis, I see new products that utilize those large language models, and I think it's just a matter of time when these spill over to IoT devices, wearables, personal assistants, and all the devices that we're really interested in building.
I see the same story with machine learning, but related in correlation with the sensors, with some wearables. Try to learn our body, our trainings, and then we can get some more information on what we have to eat, how to make a trainings, and so on.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's a very exciting kind of space to follow for sure, with a lot of different things going on that I'm sure you all have your hands in pretty greatly. The language models is super interesting. I just watched a podcast yesterday kind of talking through it, and I was actually having a conversation earlier today outside of the podcast just about how a lot of companies out there, when it comes to implementing AI in their solutions, are more so kind of doing it for the marketing purposes to feel included, but they're not necessarily truly bringing AI capabilities into their solution. So how are companies really going to implement powerful AI? Now, and at the same time, I know that AI requires data, and a lot of times when it comes to just thinking about enterprise AI, you have IoT is going to be a big driver of that data, which is why they go together so well. But when it comes to the language models and such, it's really interesting. It's going to be interesting to see how enterprise IoT companies adopt and build for the future when it comes to the AI side of things.
Yeah, really excited for for the things to come.
Absolutely. So for our audience out there who's watching this and wants to follow up, learn more about what you all have going on, and ask any questions, what's the best way they can do that?
Visit our site withintent.com. There's everything there. You will find us in our contact details as well over there. So I think that's the best starting point, and follow us on Twitter and elsewhere.
Fantastic. Well, thank you both so much for taking the time. Great conversation, very relevant topics right now. So appreciate you kind of coming on, taking some time out of your day to talk with our audience. Excited to get this out. And then, hopefully we'll talk again in the future and do some more content together.
Amazing. Thank you for having us.